and welcome everybody, and good morning. I hope you're having a start to a good day. Um, yeah, as Nicholas was mentioning, we're recording this time. The third one, we didn't unfortunately be able to record that, but I'm going to do a special check-in on Friday so we get at least that recorded to the library. We had a lot of really good chat, which actually I had changed a few slides from the session three and sent the PDF right after. So it's always good to get some chat going. Again, keep your microphone and your camera muted. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at me at my can.flywheel@gmail.com email address. This is a continuing series of 5. It's city's commitment to improving the permit processing, communication, building, and stream members. We're doing the 5 online sessions to review local building regulations, the 2020 National Building Code, and the overview of some permit processing as it fits into different elements of the code. The presentation is conceptual. I tried my best to provide some pertinent information to help educate you, especially in this topic of 9.10. There's so much to cover. We could probably do 3 sessions alone in 9.10. But I'm just trying to touch on a few items. And if you do notice an error or have a question, then please let me know. And I can do some more research with the team and follow up with an updated slide deck. So again, we're on 4 or 5. I'll be refilming framing, including the permanent wood foundations on Friday. And with the hope that these all lead into, it's going to start looking at building out a guide of residential or Part 9 construction. So what needs to be on permit drawings, what type of inspections, trying to give the city's commitment, again, to provide a general outline of, the do's and don'ts, so the whole process moves a lot easier. This session, I'm going to do the best I can to, just touch on some general overview of 9.10. Again, it's quite large. So we're going to go over the principles of fire, some occupancy classifications, building size, fire separations, and smoke type barriers. That's really important. The difference with firewalls. We're going to jump into some probably a quick session on spatial separations, because again, that can get quite involved in itself, probably its own 90-minute session. Really wanted to talk about fire blocking, fire department access, and some of the challenges with infill development that every city is facing right now with the increase of demand of low density and some small commercial. And just a quick touch on interior finish, mostly in the cabinets and in the kitchens. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat, just put, again, introduce yourself, who you are. You're a professional developer, general contractor, trade supplier, energy advisor. Just let that in there, because again, I do go back and review that to see who's in attendance. Workshop series. This is from the illustrated guide. This is 2020-15, but they also have the 2020 out. And I really like it because it explains, the 5 main categories, and we've been kind of going back and forth. And in this one, we're really sticking into fire protection. So there really isn't a lot in there. There's the only 2 is 21 and 22. So we'll try to stay in this focus, but you can see where you can kind of start thinking about plans and developing plans and how the city inspects things and how we kind of educate out. So this is a helpful guide. Just another reminder, I put this in the last session. I always get confused with calling parts sections and sections articles. So just a reminder that this is how the code is laid out. And there's a lot of and or statements too. So we'll try to cover some of those off over the next 2 sessions as well. The workshop series, there's some links. So if you go onto the city's website, and there's also some new building bulletins, mostly about the structural stuff. So I know that's been a big concern, and working with the suppliers up where you are, and just trying to work those through. So I do typically put these into links. So anytime you see kind of this hyperlink underlined blue, you'll know that there's a link associated on the website. And I'll try not to say too much, but it's just a bad habit I can't seem to break. We have learning references that I use. So obviously the National Building Code, looking directly into acceptable solutions in Part 9, housing and small buildings. We do have a new housing and small buildings illustrated guide. It's pretty much the same, but they actually have added a few more diagrams and built out a few references. I wish they would have built out some more items regarding penetrations and fire separations with some diagrams. 'Cause that's been a bit confusing. Even here in BC, we've harmonized those parts, so we're a lot closer there. And there's some really good videos that have been developed by the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, and I have a link there. They have some really good videos, and I'll highlight one as we move through this. Housing in small buildings, whether you're a building official, a designer, a builder, a tradesperson, or somebody else within that part of the industry, the transition from a single dwelling unit, whether it's a with or without a secondary suite, to a small commercial multi-unit residential can be very, very challenging and introduces a number of new code elements found mostly in 910. Other important parts of the code to review are a 952 barrier-free design, 9.8 stairs, ramps, handrails, and guards. As it's private versus public, there's a lot of changes, so you have to catch yourself when that stair is a private versus a public stair. And means and egress, I'm going to just touch on a little bit of that. I would say as a building official, this is the highest failure rate from a level 1 to a level 2. And then we have one more as a level 3, that's a complex building. It's the hardest transition to make of just adding these new elements in here. And I do want to kind of touch base and highlight some of these. Overview of housing in small buildings. So we're looking at the application part in the code of 1.333. And this is where part 9 is settled in. So we have part 9, we have part 3, and they're based on the size and height of the building, but also some uses. So this outlines here. I'd highly recommend that you go into the definition section of the code, and especially in this area, if you're in a part 9, if you're doing a commercial tenant alteration or a small townhouse or even a strip mall, this is where you're going to be living in. And when you look at an example of the definition, occupancy means, for residential, means the use of a building or part thereof persons whom sleeping accommodations provided, but who are not harbored for the purpose of receiving care or treatment and are not involuntarily detained. So those are the group care homes and the detention facilities. So we're just dealing with living units that have a sleeping unit, and they normally would also include a cooking facility, but it's not necessarily required as a definition. So we look at 3 stories or less and a building area not exceeding 3. So I just wanted it out like this, and I brought in some specific definitions. So we have, I think it's really important because this gets challenging when we have buildings. And I know you have the frost protection challenge, so your buildings are probably normally sitting quite a bit into the ground as much as possible. But at times you may, on a sloping site, start running to difficulties where you're designing a larger multi-unit building, and you're like, oh, okay, I want to do 3 stories and have a basement, and it may have a parking garage on the bottom. Well, you can look here. We have basement, we have building height, and it relates to the first story. And first story means the uppermost story having its floor level not more than 2 meters above grade. And it gives a definition of grade, but it also parts of the code talk about ground, and then it doesn't give a definition of ground. So we'll stick to grade means the lowest of the average level. So you could look at the front face of the building, the side or the back, and you could have different elevations, different grade elevations on that side view or the front view, but it's an average of that. So on this diagram here, you see that on the right side we're less than 2 meters, and on the back side with the sloping lot we're on 2. So really we've moved from a 3-story building to a 4-story building, and it kicks us out of part 9. You do have some exceptions for localized depression. So a driveway, a door well, a deep window well / door patio. It really depends. But you also, when you start introducing those wells, you also have to think about what we talked about the last few other sessions, particularly foundations. You got frost protection issues to deal with there. Like I said, finished ground is not defined. Building area sometimes this is problematic because somebody will draw or lay out a building, and then they'll have a cantilever, and they'll forget that the building area is actually the horizontal plane when you're looking down at it, not just the main floor. So if you do, have a plan review and elevation here, it has to, run out to the full horizontal width and depth of that building size. There are some exceptions though, if you have included a firewall, and that's why firewalls is kind of the use within the industry to start breaking up buildings, because then it creates, and we'll go over this a lot, fire compartments. So you have one building, one fire compartment, but if you if it's a little bit bigger than 600 meters squared, then you can start chopping up. There's other items that go along with it, and ultimately, how big is this building going to be? You just can't keep chopping it up with firewalls. But we will talk about that later on in slide 54. I have a lot of slides, so I'll keep going here. I did get some comments from staff over the last week. Been going back and forth. I've been tweaking some slides. So these are some of the ones I've kind of rolled up. Fire blocking for residential buildings. Know the difference between fire blocking and fire stopping. That's really important, especially as a supplier. So if we do have a supplier or somebody who knows somebody who's supplying buildings, equipment, building products, that it's really important to understand, what you're selling your builders and homeowners. And this and the item with duplex party walls in a pipeline, it seems like there's a number of those in Whitehorse. You have a different type of legislation. So I've heard about some townhouse challenges and how that title is registered at occupancy or after occupancy, and it does create some problems when you go through the design and building process because you're not really conforming until some of that's in. Probably Richard could explain it a lot better, but if we have time, we'll deal with that at the end, or I'll update it. I'll talk to Richard and the team and just update the slide deck just to explain it a little bit more because it's different than me because we just set up when we register lots, it's just set up a lot different down here in BC. Fire protection section of the BCBC, small buildings, including houses, is founded on principles intended to establish provisions that provide a reasonable level of life safety and property protection. So not only the property, the building itself, but other properties adjacent to it. It's also important for the occupants of the premises and the safety of firefighters and emergency responders engaged in the emergency operations. So I used to always say, well, get the people out and don't worry about it. If it burns down. And I've had personal experience. I watched my own house burn down as a kid, so I'm a bit sensitive in this area. But the firefighter, what about us? We have to go in and try to get people out if they're, smoke has, passed out. We have to try to deal with that fire, emergency response. So, usually in a disaster emergency response situation where there's no power, you're relying on, a little bit extra time if there's a fire, though, for those passive fire separations to contain those so the fire department can get out there. So it's really important to think about everybody who's associated with that building or that property when we're thinking about fire protection. This is from the table. I thought it was really great, so I included it here. And as I go along, I'm going to try to acknowledge where I'm gaining some of these images from, just for, I hope, for copyright purposes. But I just wanted to highlight where some of these are coming, so you can go in there and have a really close look at the illustrated guide. But this is a really great one, especially if you're designing, designing building, and you want to develop your floor plans, your permit sets, and really think through have I covered everything pertaining to 910. So this is a really great one here. Some basic principles of fire. So how fire spreads, it's either through convection, radiation, and conduction. So in most cases, when we have a house fire or a building fire, an internal one, we're looking at convection is probably the most prominent one, and I'll go over that a little bit. Then we have radiation. Radiation could be, now we're talking about spatial, and spatial is, a building at property lines or building adjacent to another building. And there's certain parameters of how many openings and how close they are and your wall constructions. So that's your radiation, because that heat is radiating out. And then conduction. Conduction kind of comes into play where you have a pipe penetration through fire separation. And if there's a fire, like a metal pipe, and that fire is, quite intense, it'll create enough heat in that pipe to transfer and actually create a problem on the other side of that fire separation. So a lot of fire stopping elements. We won't get a chance to talk about it too much, but it's an FT rating. So the F, and then the temperature of the T. So that's some of the conduction items there. We also want to think about how fire is initiated and how it really grows. If anybody has watched the movie Backdraft, you can see it's almost like a living organism. It feeds on oxygen, it feeds on wood or some other building product and moves its way. It wants to go from a high concentration to a lower. So unfortunately, if we're not doing the job we want in creating fire compartments and dealing with penetrations in fire compartments or concealed spaces in fire compartments, we can go from lower level without a lot of knowledge of it actually moving into the attic space. And Richard sent me a video of a large townhouse complex burnt down. And here in the Okanagan, I think within a matter of 2 years, a few years ago, that we had about 4 or 5 burned down because the fire got into the attic space and then it's wiped out the building because it just either moved through the outside or moved through the inside somehow because there's a lot of holes in it. So we have oxygen, heat, and fuel. And if we can control any one of those three elements, we're probably really in a good state of controlling that fire from growing. So I mentioned convection. So this type of heat transfer occurs only in liquids and gases. The heat from a fire can heat the air to a very high temperature. Hot air will always rise and it will flow under the ceiling of a room, spreading the heat from the fire. This is the main way in which fire spreads through a house. When a fire is burning, large amounts of hot gases and smoke are produced. This will travel through the hot house and the hot air currents, often igniting more combustible material. So it just quickly spreads. And if you have a chance and you wonder why, like smoke alarms and the intensity of heat and smoke, and you can probably Google smoke alarm flashover, and a fire can grow so intensely in smoke and heat. It takes about 70 to 90 seconds from a time like a couch fire goes from a smoldering to a flame. At 79 seconds, it's in an intense situation where the whole room is filled up with heat and smoke. So you can see how fastly, and from this diagram, you can see how it moves quite quickly. And smoke is the killer in most cases, and especially in house fires. Fire safety systems. So fire safety features in this section, we broadly divide into 6 principal categories. This again is from the illustrated guide. Protecting the structural elements. So there's a number of code sections in there, and subsections, I mean. Dividing the building into fire compartments. Again, very, very key on that, controlling the fire. Controlling the rate of fire spread within a compartment. So materials, controlling the spread of fire from one building to another. So that's our spatial. Providing an early warning of fire through alarms. So we have smoke alarms, fire detectors, and fire alarm systems. And we'll touch base on a little bit of that. Providing access to the building for firefighters. So that's one of the last ones we'll talk about. And the way part 910 and part really 910 have been evolving, and more so probably in the BC code, the last round of BC codes, the harmonization. And it's really good now that we're getting a good fundamental learning of basic principles of fire and controlling fire and creating separations. And it's kind of hand in hand now with part 3. So the terminology, if you do happen to eventually jump into part 3, and especially for code officials, it makes it a lot easier understanding language. I wish part 9 was just laid out like part 3, and I'll touch on some of that as we go along. Well, I mentioned compartmentization. Compartments is the practice of dividing a building into fire compartments, either to confine fires to their areas of origin or to prevent them from reaching areas that must be kept tenable in a fire emergency. So I mentioned that, yeah, there's a fire and people get out, but then somebody has to deal with that fire. And again, you're not necessarily saving the building, but you are protecting other buildings around it. You could be needing extra time to get extraction of people. So it's just twofold on many accounts. And in that little picture, think of the box. You have a house as a box. You may have a secondary suite that's another box within the box, or you may have a multi-unit building where you have a large box, and then you have floor levels, which are boxes, and you have suites within a floor level. So you have all these little boxes. And again, as soon as you start punching holes with doors and windows and pipes and other types of penetrations, you're running some heavy risks of fire getting out of control in that area. I won't go into too much detail here, but I do try to throw in, again, definitions that I feel are important. So you should understand what a fire compartment is. A fire separation having a required fire resistance rating. So there's 2 specific terminologies to understand there. So we have a fire resistant rating, and that's that's a product that's been timed, or assembly that's been timed to resist the movement of that heat and fire, withstand the passage of flame and the transmission of heat. We have a fire separation, and then the fire separation is broken down a little bit more in the appendix note. So every time you see an A, that's an appendix note. So in the code, you can click on it and jump back. Unfortunately, you can't go back to where you were. So you may want to have a couple versions of the code up. And that's something that I know because I'm sitting within the Ministry of Housing here in BC now as a team member. The national code is in a heavy stage of evolution of digital codes, and that'll transpire down to all the other provinces here. But you just want in the fire service, not always required to have fire resistance rating. It should act as a barrier to the spread of smoke and fire. So again, you could have, in a suite, it's not necessarily a fire separation, but it's a barrier, and it's mostly a smoke barrier. But you could have office spaces that have a non-rated fire separation. There's 0 fire resistance rating, but you still have to contain, and even you can even go further where maybe it's not even required enough, but I won't get into that too much. And party wall, because this is really important. So talking to Richard and the team, and when I was up there in December, kind of seeing what's going on there and the challenges you have with the title and just the wording and how that's processed means a wall jointly owned and jointly used by two parties under easement agreement by right in law and erected at or upon a line separating two parcels of land. So that property line there. So we'll touch on that as well. Going to skim through these pretty quick, but I just want to, go back and just talk about floor areas and limits to secondary suites. A little bit, well, actually quite a bit different than BC because we actually require fire resistance rating on top of the sound separations, but we do allow for relaxations for existing buildings and people renovating, putting suites in. And that, to my understanding, is not there. So I just wanted to, before I forget it, there are some stipulations, especially doors. You still have to pay attention to the doors in these areas. And again, the sound separations. This is the only slide I believe I have on means of egress. I do feel it's really important to understand this. This is the only time I'll talk about it, but it's really important to go back and spend some time in looking at 9.9 fire protection, occupant loads. That's one of the things we will touch on right after this. Fire protection of exits, egress of dwelling units, signs, exit signage, and lighting. Because if you get into again this world of a multi-unit or commercial, small commercial under Part 9, you're going to have to understand those elements in there and when it applies and when it doesn't apply. And looking at 9912 fire protection, several cleans that means of egress must comply with the fire spread, fire resistance rating, and fire protection ratings. So again, that's why I want to touch on it because they're kind of hand in hand when you're trying to get people out of the building. Occupant loads, that's, as mentioned here when we at 9913, just an understand occupant loads. Really, this table is from the code 31171. And, for this presentation, and in most cases, you'd probably be working in a residential section. We're dealing with occupant loads. And when you're dealing with residential units, it's 2 persons per sleeping room in a dwelling unit. So you add up all the bedrooms or what could be a bedroom. And that's sometimes a debate between you and the building department. It gets into more of a situation where you got a larger building or a quote unquote a care type facility where you have a number of people, and then those occupant loads start triggering into the size or the dimension of egress and exits, fire alarm systems, sprinkler systems, those type of things. So I just wanted to touch on that. Occupancy classification, and except for 91022, and we'll touch on that probably. But I just wanted to highlight again, these occupancies are what's in Part 9, and in Group C under the breakdown. There's a further table in here of Group C. It's covering a lot, but we're probably looking in areas where the mid low density housing is apartments, hotels, houses, and motels. Integrated protection of life safety systems. Just to highlight, I think what I wanted to highlight here, and there's some really commentary in the appendix note, is that when you have a building that starts introducing life safety components, you may have a couple of different professionals involved at that level of the building type. And you have a number of tradespeople that could be installing doors, and then those doors are, connect to the fire alarm system. And, so you have a lot of moving parts. They really wanted to emphasize, and this came into code a number of cycles ago, just you need to have this coordinated. You need to have it properly verified. And it's always a struggle of who's verifying. And I know that's probably a struggle up in Whitehorse of, is there professionals capable of testing this out, or their certified peoples to make sure that all the work that's done in life safety systems are coordinated, commissioned, and they're going to work if something does go wrong. You're probably very well aware of the home type care occupancies, but I just wanted to highlight this. And there's a really great video. So I mentioned the CBHCC, the Canadian Board of Harmonized Construction. They have a really good video on this. I think it's a great idea. It allows for some flexibility for lower scale housing for seniors. And, there are 2 exceptions for sprinklers. So I highlighted those on the side. So we're dealing with 1-story buildings and 2-story buildings. And I didn't want to spend time going too deep, but I just wanted to highlight again that there is this. There's a great need for it, obviously. So there's an opportunity. It's reserved in the BC Building Code. But I think it's something definitely to look at, and the fire department, and understand where the fire department stands in these matters, because dealing with persons, senior persons, you don't know their cognitive abilities, their physical abilities, and sometimes when you see people in lift assisted living, they're almost at a stage where they should be in a care home, but there is no space in a care home, and that becomes really problematic. Major occupancy above a major occupancy. So we're just dealing with a major occupancy. So we could have retail, we could have office, so that's a group D, or residential group C. And this clause say when you have multiple major occupancies on top of each other, you have to take the worst case scenario when you're looking at the rest of the code in some aspects. And I have another slide that kind of blocks that out. Or if you have, a larger floor plan and you have a small occupancy, kind of standalone within a larger, um, and it may be more stringent on the code requirements. The code is allowing you a 10%. So that second part there, that more than one major occupancy, not exceed 10%, you don't have to go to the most restrictive if you're keeping that size. And that does come into play sometimes, not necessarily in part nine. You might see it in other types of projects, and the 910, 9.8 fire resistance and combustibility. So that's what that mentioned here, Article 910.8.1, and we'll go into that a little bit more. Fire resistance rating and fire protections, where fire resistance rating or fire protection. So I just wanted to touch on fire protection because we haven't talked about that yet. So just fire resistant rating, fire protection. Fire protection rating means the time in minutes or hours that a closure will withstand the passage of flame when exposed to fire under specified conditions. And an enclosure is, you probably, imagine it's a door. It can be other things, glass block. It could be a damper, and all those hardwares and components all have to work together to be considered a rated closure. So we have fire resistance rating or fire protection rating is required this section for an element of the building. Such rating shall be determined in conformance with test method in part 3. But I do want to touch on these next two, the calculation methods presented in Appendix D. And I'll touch on Appendix D, not necessarily the calculation, and construction specifications presented in the tables. So I just wanted to, explain, again, I won't go into the calculations, but I wanted to just outline what Appendix D is and what you can use out of it, and what sometimes code officials use, especially in existing situations where you don't know what that assembly is totally made of, but you do know some of the components, or membrane, a sealing membrane. And in the code here, it gives you some time assigned testing of certain products. So we have some wood products. We have 12.7 and 15.9, so 5/8 type X gypsum wallboard. And it really depends if it's load bearing or not load bearing. That becomes a big factor. And I think it's even more important when you're dealing with like steel studding in those matters. And then time assigned again to gypsum wallboard here. So we have, and you look at the two tables, it's time assigned protective measures of wood frame and cold steel framed walls. So that's the top table. And then we have the fire exposed side of roofs. You probably look at that as ceilings as well. Roofs is different because it's typically not load bearing. In the common sense of carrying, occupant loads. But you could have that situation. You have to make sure you're looking at the right table, whether it's a wall or a floor. You can't pick, oh, that's the highest one, I'm gonna use that, and you're kind of transposing it incorrectly. And this is the other one. We're talking about test assemblies, and there's pages and pages and pages in part 9 of walls, floors, exterior walls that comes into play. But I just wanted to highlight here, these are test assemblies must be constructed as described in description notes. It's also, there's another way of finding a fire separation, and it's called a ULC. That's a testing agency, and they have very descriptive. So you get into a real bind, and it's probably more into part 3 type projects. You get into a real bind of, I can't find something that works. And part 9, they have the tables. Part 3, it's kind of more of a, industry standard, tested assembly in a different manner. ULC is very product specific, very specific on the installation of vertical versus horizontal drywall. So it's really important to pay attention and look at these footnotes here. And, you can see here 7, 9, and 8, it really gets descriptive on the type of drywall, absorbent material. So typically it's a rock salt or I know what else, rock wool type product. that's put in there. It's requiring these. Okay, there's load bearing. So you look at the right side of this table on the top corner, fire resistance rating. So again, fire resistance rating to make up a fire separation. And so we have load bearing, non-load bearing, and then in some cases, particularly for residential, we have sound class transmissions, and we'll go touch on that a little bit in this session today. And then at the bottom, 9 regular gypsum board is used, and single layer assemblies must be installed so all edges are supported. So all edges are supported. So all these little notes you have to take into consideration because of the inspect. So it's best to have that on a drawing. If you're picking a wall assembly, like I'm picking W1C, put that on your floor plan. You may just cut and paste it. I did here, put it on the drawing. But the builder needs to read it, and the other tradespeople who are involved in that, and the suppliers that you're supplying that product on it. Ratings. So 91033 fire exposure, floor, roof, and ceiling assemblies should be rated from the exposure to the fire on the underside. And again, I'm explaining this because there's a bit of debate sometimes, especially with tenant alterations, and we're not meeting the minimum fire separation, fire resistance ratings. Exterior walls shall be rated for exposure from the inside of the building. So there's two different ways of looking at a building and fire exposure. There's this matter here where you have a fire inside and you want to, when you get close to a property line or probably less than 1.2 meters, there's some situation where now that exterior wall has to be a fire resistance rating. It's not a fire separation because you can't provide a continuous barrier because you got windows in it if it's but again, typically under 1.2 meters you wouldn't have any openings in it. So there's two, so the exterior walls on the inside, and then 3, your interior vertical fire separations. And fire doesn't care which way it goes vertically. So you could have a fire on either side. So when you look at the diagram, you get a fire in one suite, one fire compartment, and it wants to burn through. So it's going to have to burn through that drywall material, probably maybe even a resilient channel as part of that assembly, maybe a rock salt bat in there, and then burn through the structural. So you can see it's just adding up. Remember that Appendix D where they know kind of the timed assemblies. These are in most part tested assemblies or enough time has gone by or enough testing with different types of assemblies they can put these together. So fire wants to always go up. You have to protect the spread of fire moving from inside out of the building. And when you're inside in suites, it can go either way. So if you're doing a tenant alt and you can't quite make it, sometimes you maybe double up on the worst side because you can't go in and change the suite if you have a change of occupancy. So that's something you need to talk with your building official if you're doing a tenant alteration and there's a unit that's occupied and actually now you're changing the fire separation from 45 minutes to an hour to 2 hours. It becomes really problematic, especially coffee shops and those type of things where you may trigger an assembly use, which again might kick it into something totally different. I cut and pasted this part of the mezzanine, so you can see here you can have a cool loft type mezzanine here, and typically it's not a big issue because it's 1 or 2 stories, and this is just relating to when you don't require a mezzanine to be considered a story. So maybe by building height, which could trigger other things within the code. It might even kick it out of Part 9. It could kick in exiting routes, fire separation. So if this loft here, either on the top or the bottom picture, is considered a story, you couldn't necessarily, you'd have to encase that, and you would move from a floor assembly that's a fire resistance rating to a fire separation, and then making sure that exiting route is out there. So there's a lot of things that could trigger, but typically in lower density housing and small projects, you're not going to run into this lot. But I just wanted to highlight, like down on the bottom, and again, cut and paste right out of the code, so I won't go over it too much, but I did want to add it as a storyline here. Subdividing walls higher than 1070 millimeters or 42 inches above the mezzanine floor. So in this case, you can have it open, but you can't, and there's a next slide I'll talk about enclosed areas. You want to be able to visually see up there if there is smoke, and so because you have a lot of exemptions for this space here. So at least you want to be able to see, or somebody to see in there, and that's the reason why. There's also allowance for enclosed areas. So you have a mezzanine, but then you may have a little office space. So you have a kind of a storage workspace and a more of an industrial, more probably a warehouse type building. But then you can have a little setup here where you have an office space. It can still be considered a mezzanine. Get those relaxations, but as long as it's not 10%. The other part to remember though, and something that had changed in the code is typically we didn't look at the bottom, like what's underneath, and people would build office spaces and storage racking, and it wasn't really, we could try to figure, well, that doesn't seem right because it you can't really see under, and you can see want to see on top, but you can't see under what's going on. So they've actually, this part of the code does not restrict enclosing the space below the mezzanine, but the enclosed area must be deducted from the area of the overall space before applying the percentage allowed. So you can see, instead of that A being from wall to wall, you have actually shrunk it down. So that may again parlay into what size mezzanine you can have above. And there's a couple mentioning about superimposed mezzanines. So this is an example of an industrial use where typically you'd get that exemption, but if you're stacking them, you don't get those exemptions anymore. There's some really interesting wording in the coding, in the code itself, when you really start looking at different sections and where they're highlighting certain elements. And this one I just wanted to highlight. So we got permitted openings in a wall or ceiling membranes. Appears by openings into assembly unless the assembly has been tested for such. I don't think a lot of assemblies, and again, other than maybe a ULC, a very product specific, very specific use of a in a building type situation. And two, a wall ceiling membranes forming part of an assembly required to have a fire resistance rating permitted to be pierced by openings by electrical and similar. And we'll go a little bit more into that. So you could have an opening, a piercing of the membrane as part of the assembly. You could have a pipe going through. So that's what I was trying to show there. And then it makes some further references in Appendix D, which we touched on already as well. Fire resistance rating combustibility in relation to occupancy, height, and supporting elements. So remember a few slides ago, we just talked about when you have major occupancies and they may be stacked on top of each other, you're kind of taking the worst case scenario in here. In part three, it doesn't really, when you're talking about the construction of the building, you have to look at a multi-story building. You take, so if I have a group E, a group D, and a group C scenario on a small, probably max out on a part 9 building, and that group C may have a couple of units in it. And again, the group D may have a couple units in it, and the group E may have one or two down there. You're looking at, obviously the building can only be 3 stories, can only be 600 meters in building area. And here it's like everything here is 45 minutes. When you get into part 3, it gets way more problematic. And that's just, again, the construction element part, and it's a fire resistance rating of the floors and roofs. And we'll talk about fire separations in a few more slides. But I just wanted to remind you that we kind of defined it. Now we're looking at this, all their occupancy. So if you go to group E and it's classified as a group E, major occupancy of 3 stories, should we also consider that roof now in that element? And I'm going to do a little more research on that one and follow up with the updated slide deck. On that, 9, 10, 8, fire resistance, again, continuing on, fire resistance ratings for walls, columns, and arches. So you can see in here, I've put the vertical arrow underneath, from orange to green, and that's, your fire resistance rating. So anything holding up those elements also have to have a rating. All load-bearing walls, columns, arches, and stories immediate below a floor and roofs assembly should have a fire resistance rating. Again, not a fire separation, but a fire resistance rating. Light walls and frames. So we have dwelling units in a house with secondary suites. They're not asking for fire separation. Here in BC, we do with new suites, even conversion of existing basement rentals. But they're just looking at including a so in sentence 2, light frame walls, columns, arches, and beams, as well as the load-bearing steel elements that support floors between dwelling units in a house of secondary suites, including the common spaces, shall be protected by at least not less than half-inch gypsum wallboard. And there's a little bit of an explanation in the appendix note there. This is something that got altered in BC. They did kind of like, we don't worry about it anyway. Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? To have the floor rated, but then not have so that was a good catch on the harmonizing process. Application to houses. So we can look at table 910.8.1. Does not apply to a dwelling unit that has no other dwelling unit above. So we obviously wouldn't, worry about first floor, second floor, third floor in a house, or basement to first floor. There isn't a fire separation. I didn't put in the slide, but there seems to be an urban myth at a small level that a garage for a house has to be have a fire separation from the rest of the house. It doesn't. It's just basically I wouldn't even say it's a smoke barrier. It's a fumes barrier. And then you have your door into the house with the self-closer. So I didn't have a slide on it, but this is my mic. It does come up from time to time. Houses with a secondary suite where the floor framing is protected on the undersides. Again, we went over that. And a dwelling unit that is not above another below another major occupancy on those. I think the fire separation stuff comes from the ICC. Yeah. Um, a lot of in North America, a lot of codes talk to each other. They have code developers. So the NRC talks a lot with the ICC, the International Code Council, if I'm reading that acronym right. There's also a number of other codes used in the states. Each state may have their own code association, but ICC is the biggest one here. So we went on that one. Application. So I just wanted, again, a reminder. So the application, the subsection applies to fire separation between rooms and spaces in the building and smoke type barriers required in houses with a secondary suite. So they've made that distinction there. And then now we're getting into the part of continuous barriers because this is really important containment, not of fire, but more so smoke. And again, smoke is probably the major killer, especially in low density and high density housing. And just as a reminder, this is from the illustrated, or no, from the front of the code, the fire separation. Just again, a reminder, although a fire separation is not always required to have a fire resistance rating, it should act as a barrier to the spread of smoke and fire until some type of response is initiated. So giving those responders some time to get to the site, get set up, and do what they need to do before they either lose the whole building or they can't get somebody out because the fire is so developed in that part. Oh, and just that comment in the chat there, the ICC in the garages. That again, it's probably a American code standard that has drifted into the Canadian realm, and you don't really need to worry about that. Continuous barrier. Just want to highlight, especially these diagrams here. So sentence 3, we're looking at continuity of fire separation and where that element bumps into there. I'm going to double check that because I think that number is actually not correct. It should be. Yeah, that may be right. Let me double check, but typically you have a fire separation, you have a concrete floor assembly. There isn't a perfect, you can't tightly fit that, so you have to have some fire stopping there. If you have a building that has, I don't think you'd ever have that in a Part 9 building. You have like what we call a curtain wall, a perimeter barrier. You'd have that fire stopping there, so you can't wrap around the floor and up that building envelope. So that's that taping there. And when we're talking about gypsum board joints and assemblies described in sentences 1 and 2, so part of these fire continuous barriers, there's actually a standard. So you may want to familiarize yourself or have your tradespersons responsible for putting these systems in. There is a standard for gypsum board. And then 6, the last one here, joints between ceilings and walls and floors. So they have inherently said that in a wood frame construction and you're nailing the drywall assembly, it's tight. And even if the building moves and shrinks and a bit, that joint will stay together. So there isn't any particular issues with fire stopping when you have verticals and horizontals coming together at fire separations because everything's going to hold up pretty good. The only problem is if you do have resilient channels, you're moving that membrane away from the wall, the drywall membrane, and you may have a gap in there. So that could be problematic and either fire stop or really think through your detailing and how you're building those out. Because in the appendix, so fire stops need to be installed between the joints of interior finish materials. Yeah. So you want to ensure you're always creating that smoke barrier. And if you're moving that drywall, that says, okay, it's okay because we're going to nail it to the wood element. But now you're moving that away from there. Penetrations and fire separation except as required by sentence 2. And again, I really encourage you, when you get this in front of you, look at the illustrated guide. I've tried to add things that I didn't see in the illustrated guide in here, but there's some very specific, when you're talking about fire separations and fire stopping, there is a standard. And when you go out and find the fire stopping or source fire stopping products, please ensure that they've been tested. If I can say anything other than that in there. And there's some other components here. So when you get penetration through a fire separation, it can be tightly fitted. So that's in sentence B, sealed to maintain integrity of fire separations. And there's some explanations on that. Or again, fire stop. And there's different products out there. There's foams, there's straps, there's caulking. Once you get into very large pipe penetrations, even duct penetrations, there's actually assemblies. So there are multiple components to it. And you have to be very careful because, again, if a product like Hilti says you need to use, this, and this to achieve the fire stopping in this assembly with this penetration, you can't start deviating and buying this product and that product or slightly modifying how it's put together. It's really important because it's been tested for that type of assembly. I just want to touch on, and again, image from the illustrated guide. You normally don't want pipes poking in everywhere, so piping penetration. But and again, plastic piping is a bit more of a problem, in a fire situation than non-combustible. Over the years, they've allowed more and more combustible piping. They even have, fire-rated plastic piping when more so in the large buildings. But here, it's a good diagram when you can, go through a building when you don't need to fire stop, when you do need to fire stop. So I can't get too much into detail of that, but I would read it, and this is a really great diagram for that. I did want to provide this as a reminder, and Richard is saying they have been looking at this. This is something brand new in the BC as part of the harmonization. Is you have a lot of outlet boxes, and you have to pay particular attention to these penetrations, and one is like outlet boxes are permitted to portray a membrane or an assembly, except for Bryden 2 and 5, and we'll go through some of those. But this is really if you have this requirement and this is the type of assembly, this is the type of fire stopping product you'd use on it, and it specifically tells you how to wrap it and how to set it up on it. So that's one way of looking at fire stopping. There is an exception, and you have to be very careful on non-combustible versus combustible boxes because it does outlay it a little bit. So here it says, except for 910, 962, non-combustible outlet boxes that penetrate a fire separation of membrane forming part of an assembly. So piercing, has pierced the membrane of that fire assembly. Required to have a fire system need not conform with sentence 1, provided they do not exceed, and again, it's hard to convert, in your head metrics. So I've on the bottom of that little diagrams, 25 square inches, an aggregate area. 100 square inches of total boxes within 10 square feet, or 100 square feet, 10 by 10 wall assembly. So you can see that, even on the left side there, they have a triple or quadruple gang box there. So it may not get that exemption, and that has to get fire stopped. And looking at, the annular, so it's talking about the annular space does not exceed in a non-combustible box does not exceed 3 millimeters, which is pretty small, and it kind of loosely equates to 3 millimeters is the thickness of a toonie on it. In wood frame, that putty has to be okay. Just a note here from Dustin: in wood frame, that putty has to be between the box and the stud as well. So again, read the manufacturer specification, make sure you're installing it, because the worst thing you could see is that the inspector come out and see that it is not done correctly on their audit for one or two of them, and then they would start questioning, like, is it all wrong? And then either ask the building project manager or the architect if they're involved. It's like, what's going on here? And you may even want to do a mock-up when you're starting. I always recommend people starting fire separations or building envelope detailing. Call your building official and ask them to come out. Are we doing this right? Consult with them, especially in a Part 9 project where there's a little more engagement allowed versus a Part 9 or a Part 3 monitoring process. And just say, yeah, that looks good. And because a building official can't check everything, but, typically in a house, not a house, but, a multi-unit building, commercial building, there's not a lot, but there's enough that as soon as you start seeing the first few wrong, then it all goes sideways pretty quick. Except for provide, so this is sentence 3 in that same article. And except for provide in sentence 9.2, combustible outlet boxes that penetrate fire. So, again, they allow some allowances. They allow, and again, for time, I don't have a lot, so I drew a little diagram. I was trying to figure it out, trying to do a secondary suite presentation here in BC. You can create these little boxes within the box to control it. There's some other parameters in it. And you kind of think about this as a fire blocking scenario we'll go over. And then you have these penetrations. You also have to make these penetrations, for a pipe or a wire that goes through this. Sorry, let's grab a glass of water. You do have to look at the integrity of the fire blocks, and that's that last sentence there with the circle. If you start poking holes in there, and then you'll also might hit resilient channels on that wall if it's as a rated tested assembly may have furring. on it. So you have to take care of that too. So you can see there's combustible and non-combustible boxes, and there's different ways of trying to go around that. Non-combustible outlet boxes, there's some spacing allowances. So I did a little diagram, the best of my abilities to try to figure out, like, you got back to back. You never want to put back to back, but the code, and that was more of probably a lot older code. This is way more specified in where and spacings of it. So it's really good that it's in here. So you should be knowledgeable of it. The designer should actually put some details in there. If you have multi-unit fire separation, put a note about penetration. So then the people on site should know and should follow that. And the building officials shouldn't have any issues when they go on site. Separation of residential occupancies. So I just highlighted a few in here. We're talking about major occupancy. So we talked about what is a major occupancy, and defining what that building is when you're kind of stacking units one on top of each other. We talked about the minimum construction or fire resistance rating requirements of a multi-unit building. This one's now talking about suites. So separating these uses more definitively. And we're talking about major occupancies here, and we're talking about a residential occupancy, but you could have other occupancies, obviously. And like in sentence two, if we had a two-story group E underneath a group C, you'd actually have a different fire. And again, we're talking about fire separations in here. So okay, we got sentence one, except as provided in sentence two, residential occupancy shall be separated from all their major occupancies by a fire separation, having a fire resistance rating. So we're combining those two. So we go into sentence two. If you got mercantile group E, right over, you could have that in a small unit, mixed commercial, residential. You're looking at the 2 hour, and you also have to remember anything supporting that has to change. So even though your building itself, construction wise, is 45, now you have to play this into, and again, really think through the design and put up really good notes and put a lot of really good details there, and have the builders and the people on site actually follow those, because that is lost in communication sometimes too. And we're looking at suites. So again, suites within a floor area. So you could have offices, or other types of uses separating. You could have residential units, multi on one floor area. So that section here, and I can't get into too much detail here, but I did want to, and this is one question, if, it'd be great if the suite bulletin was done up. And I know that's probably one of the projects that the Whitehorse team is working on, just for consistency, or just pulling stuff out of the code, but also providing. And we'll hopefully have a little bit of this in the guide when we talk about setting up suites in homes. But I just wanted to highlight here that, separation of residential units, it's typically 45 minutes. If we have more than 2 stories, so that's sentence three, I'm just going to jump to sentence three here. So you have a duplex or a townhouse set up. You're no longer, and it's more than 1 story, you're looking at 45 minutes to 1 hour of your vertical fire separation. That vertical separation has to go all the way through. There are some exceptions to that, but in most cases for low density housing, you're going all the way to the other side of the roof sheathing there. And then when we throw in sentence four, it's secondary suites. And again, those relaxations that you wouldn't see in some other codes there. And openings protected. So I just wanted to make sure, and the team had noted that, again, both sides of the walls, gypsum wall board, the underside of the flooring, ceiling framing. So your floor assemblies have to be done and set up properly. And then you're looking at closers. And again, that closer, it can't be a hollow core door. It has to be at least a solid core door. And this is an interesting detail I found from Saskatoon, because they are also under the national code. So I just wanted to throw that in there with the link. So you should be able to look at that. And one very excellent guide, a very large guide, you can still find online and download. The only problem is it is starting to get a little outdated, but the basic principles are the same for fire stopping and fire blocking. So I'd highly recommend, if you get a chance, and you can see some of the disasters that happen out there. And a lot of those disasters for fire separations are after occupancy, when your tail cable guy or something's changed inside, your property maintenance person not really paying attention. And the way they cut holes is with a hammer, and you start bashing stuff in and not really thinking about the consequences. Because again, we spent all this time at building it out to provide these separations, and then quite quickly a building can burn down because it gets out of hand, and the fire department trying to figure out, how did that start here, and now it's on the other side of the building. What's usually, this is the problem here, poking holes in it. I'm gonna ask for questions, but I'm not gonna take a break. because I still have a bunch to go through. And if you have any questions, I'm going to try to um, answer as we go, or if I can't, definitely have been looking at these and either building out some more explanatory in a slide deck, but I'm just going to keep going here. Firewalls, you know, a little bit different in Whitehorse than probably here. We normally wouldn't see this anymore. The scenarios where you have you have property lines, and then you have a townhouse unit. And I honestly don't know enough. I'm gonna have to learn a little bit more and talk with the team on this. But I just want to like firewalls are not required. So typically a firewall is a fire separation that is non-combustible construction and has a fire resistance rating at least 2 hours. And there's a little description on the bottom and that's from a defined part of the code. You know, but there's an exception. So a party wall on a property line of a building of a residential house need not be constructed as a firewall, provided it's constructed as a fire separation, not having less than 1 hour fire resistance rating. So fire separation, fire resistance rating. The two dwelling units where there is no dwelling unit, above another. So here we have 4 townhouses. So we could typically probably get away, maybe 1 and 2 being a 1 hour fire separation, and then 3 and 4. But that we have more than 2. And even in here with the star on it, we're building a residential contains more than 2 houses. So you can see it gets quite problematic on how you design it and how you build it versus the end product on it. And that's something I think that needs to be reviewed as a whole, because I think some have been done, and now the fact is we're realizing try to catch up to it. Richard had mentioned, is foam spray a fire? Yeah, okay, I'll get onto that. Good question on the foam spray for fire stopping. You can see here with firewalls, again, it's a very robust system, and part 3 outlines it in detail. The rating requirements based on occupancy types. It typically would extend through the roof, so there's quite a distinctive breakage in it. You can see on the detail on top, you don't butt it into a building envelope or the exterior wall. It has to go through. There are probably some complications with thermal assembly, so you can see how different the details are between one or the other on there. And then your firewalls is a part 4 component. It has to stand on its own, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or more stories. So it requires a structural engineer involved in there. This is a placeholder, but prevention of fire spread exterior walls in between buildings. So we are going to talk about spatial in a little bit here, but you can see that even in a building in itself, you could expose one fire compartment to another if you're not being careful with your design and where you're putting your windows. So on the left there, there's a magic degree point of 135 on it. If you go more, I guess, yeah, more than that. So you're moving from parallel to now you're going like this on an angle. There's some limitations how close those openings be, and even the material, the wall construction of it. And then soffits are a huge problem. And I'll touch on that in fire blocking, but soffits are a big problem. And once the fire gets from the building into the roof, it's a total wash on that. So I just want to touch on that. Doors and dampers, the purpose of closures is to hinder the passage of fire. So we talk about protected closures, and this is where this element is in here. All devices that close off openings through fire separation are referred to as closers. These must be tested and rated. Ratings for closures, however, referred to as fire protection ratings versus a fire resistance rating. And when you look at, so we have, obviously we have doors, and doors have to closers, and we don't want to have them wedged open. Right there, we can have hold open devices that are hooked up to a fire alarm system. So when the fire alarm system goes off, the door closes. But we can have other types on the right side, other types of closures. You have wired glass block, you have wired glass in a fixed steel frame, glass block, fire dampers, and fire flaps. So that picture is from the guide. It's a fire damper. Fire dampers you have to be able to access them, so they have to have an access panel so you can get in there in case for maintenance or for other reasons. But on closures, you can see for a door, they're not like for like. So if you have 45 minutes, it's 20 minutes. If you have 2 hours, it's 1.5. If you have 4 hours, it's 3. So there's a little bit of a difference there to pay attention to. I'd probably say most standard steel steel doors frames come probably at 3 hours, but they're labeled differently depending on their usage and at a different price point. But when we look at unrated wood doors, so again, perhaps looking at our suite situation that the doors provided a 20-minute rating are permitted to be 45 minutes solid wood core doors. So again, no hollow doors in a secondary suite situation. It has to be a wood door and at least get this rating here. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We're jumping into spatial. Spatial separation sets the limits of openings in exterior walls that face a proper line between buildings and center line of a street. It also controls the type of wall construction base. So there's a lot of variables going in, and these are a few diagrams out of the illustrator guide. I'm not going to get into kind of crazy stuff like when you have offset walls and you have property lines at angles. I just want to like just the principles of this. And there are some defined terms in here. So we have, understanding your attic and roof space because that comes into play with exposing building face. And I just don't have time to read through these. And we have fire compartments. So you have, again, you're thinking about fire compartment because you're looking at the side wall of a building, but then if it's different fire compartments, you can start chopping that up if that helps you. Not matter. Glazed openings. It's undefined. It's yeah. It's an interesting that we have unprotected openings, and then they introduced in 915, which we'll go over 91015, glazed openings, which is slightly different on the calculations. So there is some differences there. There's limiting distance. How far are you away from the property line? How far are you away from the center line of a road or designated walkway, or to another building, with one exception on private property. And we have unprotected them. So that was really that. So you have your building face, your exposed building face, and then you have openings in it, or you have glazed units in it. And there's a certain percentage based on where you are to the property line. And that's what that diagram there. So like all these, you have to study your site plan, you have to study your floor plan and your elevations. You have to take that into account as you're going through. And if you start changing stuff, or particularly it starts changing on site for interior separations, particularly when you're getting pretty close to the property lines, that could really make a problem at time of frame inspection if you don't talk to your building official. So do that. So 14, so I just want to 14, so 14 and 15, spatial separation between buildings, and then spatial separation between houses. And so we have, this applies to buildings other than those in 915, so houses, and subject does not apply to detached carports. So that's been kind of taken out. And there's a little bit of an explanation on that. And it talks about when is a carport, a garage versus something else. So we have that. We have limited distance and fire response time. So again, being very mindful of your fire response time and being able for the truck and the crew to get to the site and out and set up. And there's some time limits to that, exposing building face. And there's some particular limits in there. And then typically when you get to, in the sentence C in 910, 14.4, where a building limit is not less than 1.2 meters, you can start using different methods of calculations. And that gets, limiting distance squared. You can use subsection, you can use part 3. So I'm just going to regroup here. So on that openings and exposing building faces, you can use a table, which is in the code, and it gives you percentages based on the wall areas. It can give you part 3. You can go to part 3, or you can use this, if you're not less than 1.2 meters, you can kind of use this a really quick square root method. I'd recommend using the tables for consistency, but as long as you're showing the calculations of how you achieve that in the drawings, there shouldn't be a problem. It's just kind of stick to a point. And the reason is you can kind of get the best of those in those situations. But again, confirm your 10-minute response time in those areas. Still staying, so now we're in houses. So buildings that contain only dwelling units, no dwelling unit above. Again, if you have a stacked duplex, that's in 14, not 15. If you have side-by-side townhouses, that's in 15 when you have the side lot setbacks. And it also includes houses with secondary suites. And, we digs into more of the application of the section. And I just highlighted this again. We're looking at traditional detached houses, semi-detached, and they can have a secondary suite, row houses and stacked dwelling units, but you wouldn't have only a secondary suite would have stacked dwelling units, basement and floor above, but not a stacked duplex or 2 separate units. You couldn't use that in 14. Provided party wall and property line. Oh yeah, and I just want to touch on property firewalls too. I'll probably clean that up because I do talk about firewalls. Limiting distance, again, the same thing as in 14. exposing building face. Again, you can use a couple different methods as long as you show it. And I tend to stick with the tables, but you may find your own way around that. And note the difference is glazed opening, so you may not include a door now that has, a garage, a man door from a garage. While you're in 914, you'd have to take that into consideration because it is an unprotected opening. That's the rated door with the closer and those type of things on it. Just wanted to highlight here again for time's sake, your limiting distance, so you're looking at site plan. So you're trying to maximize your building envelope probably, for return on investment. So you're probably closer than 2 meters, and I'm not going to really touch on that, but that's another potential another concern here, or have soffits close to the property line if you get closer and closer. But yeah, you can see here from this chart from the illustrated guide that, once you get to 1.2 and then you get in, it really changes the game. And it also changes when you're talking about 9, 10, 14 versus 9, 10, 15. So you really want to pay attention to one, okay, your limiting distance. You want to talk about your unprotected opening or glazing percentage that you're allowed. And that really relates, you can see on the right side of that table, maximum area glazed opening. So we're 9, 10, 15. It's saying you can't have any openings. You can't have any openings. And then when you look at the last row of that table, it says, oh, now we're limit distance greater than or equal to 1.20 meters. I have to check that the alligator eats the greater of. I think that's how it works. NBC, you're using the tables in that format. So you can see that it now changes and products that you use. So I'm saying you need to use non-combustible where you may be looking at that in 914, but you have to pay particular attention if you're especially if you get a variance on a setback, you also need to look at this stuff here. There are some exceptions when you're looking at accessory buildings. So when I was talking about a garage, so a garage does not have to, in Canadian code, does not have to be fire separated from the principal dwelling. So it's almost like taking that garage and pulling it away from the building. Well, the same, you're saying that wall that's from the garage to your house, it doesn't have those same requirements you would if you had like two buildings. If these are two separate buildings, and in this case, if you converted that accessory building into I think you call it a garden suite or accessory dwelling unit, then all that comes into play. Now you have spatial issues playing, but you still have to look at the part that's facing the property lines. You still need to deal with those spatially, but not necessarily the accessory building to the house component, unless it's a different type of, even a home occupation, an office, it gets converted to. Now you have a group D to a group C, and you no longer get that accessory building exemption in that. Team wanted me just to remind everybody, they had a couple projects come in a part of town that has a lot of duplexes. They have masonry, party wall. You see that a lot. Not necessarily need to be that because we went over some of those exemptions, but maybe back in the day that was just the way it was. But the property line runs through the building, and then you have these additions that are put on. One's more than 1.2 meters from the property line, the other one's closer. So you're really going to run into some problems because you got to think about that spatial requirement goes to that property line. And the way you're not going to have any openings that's, less than 1.2 meter, and that wall construction has to be dealt with. And then you may have some openings, I talked about when you're less than, the 135 degrees. You may have some exposure issues too, and wall construction issues. So you really have to think through this when you're having this property line sitting through, because it is taken from the property line. Fire blocking. I'll spend about 10 minutes on this one and then have a few more slides to close up. Just going to grab a drink of water. This is, again, this is a part 9 house scenario, but I've been amazed in my 30 years as a building official working in large and small communities and even, traveling around the province and up in Whitehorse, the lack of knowledge about fire blocking. A lot of people think fire blocking is only required in multi-unit commercial buildings, and it's not. Back in the day, the codes were broken apart. I think the confusion was fire stopping, but time ago, fire stopping was broken apart into fire stopping and fire blocking. And I think now that sets the tone, and now we're dealing with part 9. Because remember, way back, we talked in these little boxes here, we have a box, and you want to think about the box and putting holes in boxes. and you want to think about what makes up a fire and how you control a fire from growing and spreading. And you can think this stud space, and this is taken from Fine Home Builders. They've done an excellent job of explaining fire blocking. So you can Google it. There's videos. There's really great diagrams. So I thank them for putting this. So you have an electrical failure, and it doesn't matter if that box is in that wall or if it's in that stud space. You can still have a fire in that space because you can see there's wires horizontally going through that space. That box, something happens, or there's a fire outside, a heater, and then somehow in an older home, again, you're in within a home, so there's no fire stopping or no, tight fitting outlet box because it's not a fire separation. But that stud space is a fire compartment. It's a compartment within a compartment of the wall, and you want to be able to control that. I think that's where I'm trying to explain there. And I provided the definition of fire block and a fire compartment, and really know the difference between fire stopping and fire blocking because there's a huge difference. And that foam spray stuff question I'm going to touch on here. When we talk about framing, way back in the day, and even some newer builds, they may do this, maybe in a high wall situation. But before it was balloon framing, and you can see here on the right side of that top diagram, a lot of those buildings aren't around because they have a fire, and that fire just raced through the building because on top of they weren't insulated either. So it moved from one floor to the next through the concealed wall cavity. Platform framing, we're pretty much dealt with that. I did notice though in the S 406-16 standard, they do have when you do have that raised wood floor assembly, and I'm not sure how many times it happens anymore up there, but that has to be fire blocked. Even though it's an exterior wall and it has insulation in, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But it's not fire stopping. I don't know. That's kind of troubles me when one you have a ledger and you can't do a ledger unless you have proper design because that's not. You may have a ribbon board and that floor joist is actually attached to the framing. That's part 9. Framing component, but you also have the fire. They call it fire stopping. It's not fire stopping. It's fire blocking. And I wish, again, this standard has been updated a number of times, but some of the little small things are niggly. But you can see that the old style framing and maybe even this permanent wood, you have to take conditions in consideration. Vertical concealed spaces in interior walls. So the sentence 1 in 910-16-1. So have concealed spaces. So spaces where you can't see inside and something's going wrong. And you can see here from this diagram that you could have a fire, you have smoke, and it just, again, finds its way because it's going to be eating oxygen. It's going to be eating wood. It's a breathing, living animal trying to, organism moving through. So you want to try to think about those kind of problematic situations where you've dropped down for plumbing, piping, or mechanical horizontal concealed spaces and attic spaces, roof spaces, ceiling spaces. Again, one going into the other. Fire blocks can be provided, interconnections between concealed verticals. And I have a diagram on that. And then it also goes into a number of other sentences, which I don't have time to go over. But the way I learned it as a building official, I was having trouble on some of the clauses and some of the sentences. It's like my mentor said, take your tape, go up to your wall at framing stage, and then put your tape up, and you normally hit the top plate. And that's, again, stopping fire and smoke from getting to the next level. But if you have a drop and that tape can actually now go through the drop into the ceiling space above, now your fire stop is blown, and now you have to try to deal with it in a different manner. That's just a tip. And again, there's different scenarios, even at tub enclosures. If you're not if the penetration through your subfloor, for your piping, you have the trap, and there's usually a giant hole in it. Well, what happens is there's a fire in that concealed horizontal space, and then it gets into the wall, and then it's going all over the place. So there may be some work you do as an industry in that part, but I did want to talk about wall assemblies. And, except for permitted in sentence 2, fire blocks described in sentence 1 are not required provided. And this is the reason why fire blocks described in sentence 1 are not required provided the insulated wall assembly contains not more than, 25 millimeter, gap. There's a little bit of a breakage point of a gap, and it's less than an inch. The exposed construction materials within a space are non-combustible, so there's really nothing to burn. So that's one of those elements of fire that we've taken away. The exposed construction materials within a space include insulation, but not including wiring, piping. Again, there's parameters there. A flame spread rating of 25 or less, or concealed space is filled with insulation. So in an interior wall, if you fill that space up, usually you can eliminate the need for that. I think there's some debate there for that. And I'm going to touch on that right after this slide. This is a big problem when you have shared attic spaces, overhangs in a townhouse duplexing. You have to fire block those overhangs. I don't know how many fires I've actually seen because this wasn't done in older buildings. This is as well as not taping inside the attic spaces for smoke control or in basements, unfinished basements. But this is a big, big, like make sure you get this canopies, roof overhangs. It's really, really important in there. I'm gonna follow up on the backing of the baseboard. I'll follow up separately, but I did want to show an interpretation from the BC Building Code. It was actually appeal, so it's binding to that project. And it's basically saying, I have an exterior wall, it's obviously full of insulation, so I have a drop, so I don't have to, the pellet, pellet position on the right bottom, I don't have to do the fire blocking. And for whatever reason, they decided to use 2x6 studs for fire blocking in here because it's a pain in the butt, obviously, right? And it's maybe a thermal bridge and all these other things. But the court has decided that that part of the code that you get an exemption on, interior type walls doesn't apply to exterior walls. So you still need to do it. However, you could just run that drywall up instead of putting that blocking. So we come to the question about foam. Foam spray is great. Hilti, Tremco, they all have these really great foam sprays for fire stopping, which again can transpose and you can use this as a fire block. But you can't go the other way around because that stuff here was sold as a fire block and it seems to meet the standard, but it didn't meet the standard of fire stopping. And our inspectors went inside a building and it required fire stopping, and they saw this orange and they went, "Oh my goodness." They looked at the can. It's like it's not tested as a fire stopping material. It's tested. It's a fire blocking material. So rip it all out, which was obviously a pain. And why was that supplied to them? There are some exceptions when you're looking at party walls. So instead of that little tin on the bottom diagram, you have a little tin separation there. You can use this element of the more solid rock sole. You have fire blocks, but then again, you have fire penetration. You have penetration to that fire blocking, so you have to maintain the integrity of it. So this is an outline of where you find that. Here's a diagram that we created in Penticton to try to cover all these areas. So I'll forward this to the team, and we may need to adapt it a little bit. Just to tune it up on a few items. Sorry for the resolution, but you can see just on the left, the drop and concealed space. There's different ways of doing that. I would recommend once you've set up your fire blocking or even a fire separation, don't let people touch it unless they ask you to do it. Better yet, especially for fire blocking, put that blocking in, put the OSB, put the drywall in, strip, and then do your back framing. And then or have that mechanical ducting put in there and finish your back framing, whatever you need to do. But look, you control as a general contractor, you control where those holes go, not vice versa, because it's really hard, especially when you do horizontal and you got multiple things coming through the floor in a chase. It becomes a total disaster at time of frame and insulation inspection. Feel free to put your chat. So I just want to talk about there are ratings for materials inside a building, and it plays more into larger buildings, areas where you have public corridors, exits, where there's limits on the type of products because of their flame spread. So that flame spread not only carries the flame, so that how quickly that flame can move across that material, but generate smoke. So there's limits in that in the code. Alarm and detection systems. I just wanted to highlight this. When you get into a multi-unit building, and there's certain stipulations of when it triggers. So again, except as permitted in sentence 3 and 4, fire alarms shall be installed in buildings in which a sprinkler system is installed. In the BC code, it says where required. So it's required by code, but you may also require it because of an item where you have lack of fire response, and it has to be sprinkled in. And that may be the gray area where, again, it's not technically required in code, but it's required because of a city requirement. But you still need to have that. As soon as you put a fire suppression in, you have to have a fire alarm. Except for sentence 5, a fire alarm should be installed in the building that contains 3 or more units, including stories above or below the first story, or total occupant load. So again, you have to be really cognizant of your occupant loads. In this case, it's 300. And then there's a table where occupant load for a major occupancy. Again, you might get into residential type small care home, and you have to be very cognizant of 10 sleeping accommodation, and that's typically based on the number of bedrooms. So you really have to look at your floor plan, your occupancy, and then starting to calculate those when you're looking at life safety systems. Fire alarm system is required in the buildings with sprinkler systems, and then we go into NFPA 13D, which is kind of the lowest standard for NFPA 13, just 13 NFPA 13 alone, and R, and then D. And then when we get into D, there's some significant relaxations on it. Fire alarm systems required when there's more than three or nine sprinklers. Fire alarm system not required in residential occupancy or an exit or public course. So if you have a way of getting people out quickly and it's limited in a number of units, then you don't need a fire alarm system. Don't confuse fire detectors, smoke alarms, and smoke detectors. And here, just be cognizant because this, even on drawings, have an SD. Well, you don't have an SD in a house; it's a smoke alarm. So be clear on your terminology with your designs and on site with your trades, especially you start talking about fire alarm systems. You want to know the difference as they have to be properly installed for the use and then tested and commissioned at the end. Smoke alarms won't touch too much on that, but there are some stipulations beyond a residential unit. So I just wanted to, just remind you, I read this section as a refresher. Residential fire warning systems. Again, this is in the smoke alarm section, so read that smoke alarm section in that item. Firefighting, very gray in part 9. Part 3, 3257 outlines fire department access and access onto the property. Part 9 doesn't, and a lot of communities here in BC are trying to build that up in their building bylaw because with middle missing or mid-density, low-density housing, where you may have one unit behind another unit on the same property, becomes really, really problematic. You may have a steep lot where the fire department can drive up to the property, but actually can't get to the house because it's so steep or it's in a snowy condition. So this is the appendix notes, and I found some really older diagrams. So when you're just thinking of a house, of a townhouse, of a commercial building, you have your hydrant. So your hydrant should be shown on your site plan or kind of a snap screen of where it's located for reference. The truck should hook up to that, run to the truck to the front of the property, not necessarily onto the property, but gaining access onto the property. So that's 45 minutes or 45 meters. And then they shouldn't be able to drag hose or have to drag hose more than 45 to the principal entrance of those buildings. So again, it could be one principal. It could be a multi-unit commercial, it could be a multi-unit townhouse, could be a unit in the back. So this is where you see, and Edmonton's got a good outline of this, where you're starting to see you have to get to the garden suite in the back. You don't fight fires from the lane traditionally because those aren't really dependable for snow clearage or what's being parked by there. So again, you see the red, the emergency vehicle setting up, and they have to be able to go from 45 meters from that vehicle safely onto the property. They can have closed gates. They can have all this junk in between, heat pump stuff and recycling bins and all this kind of stuff. You need to get to that garden suite and get to the principal entrance. So you may even have to turn the principal entrance towards the building to get that 40, and rather than on the side of the street. And I can go over that more if you have any more questions. So again, this all revolves around the increasing mid to low density push, which is greatly needed, but it's creating some issues not only for fire department access, but also water flow. And that's something I think as we develop the guide, we're going to get into that a little bit more. I'm meeting with representatives from the planning department to make sure we're on the same line of trying to promote housing, but also making sure the infrastructure and the fire protection is there. Fire protection for gas, propane, and cooktops. I just want to remind, there is clearance requirements, and I just highlighted a few cut and paste there. That's a really great diagram in the code. So again, what you're putting around that, whether it's electric, gas, or propane, and there's some allowances where you can go a little bit lower as long as you're protecting it. So in the second part, so shall not be less than 750 milliliters above the level of the cooktop, reduced to 600 milliliters above the level of the elements burners. We have questions about microwave units going on top, and they have a fan. It's like, does that qualify? I would really read the specifications from the manufacturer of that product to make sure, or talk to your building official around it. And again, how you're protecting it on the sides as well. And that's that last section, protection around cooktops. Sound transmission, there are sound transmission requirements other than a single family house. So we have suites. They don't have a fire separation. They're smoke type barrier, but they have sound separation. So be very mindful of that. And again, and this is where a house contains a second to each dwelling unit shall have separate from every other space, which noise can be transmitted by. So the construction, so it can vibrate through the construction, and from the air, it can move that way there. So there's some particular matters of your separation for your suite. So this is the area in here they have to pay attention. And again, detail it on drawings and follow it on the construction site there. And then just a few diagrams of how they actually test that. And I didn't want to but I just wanted to say they do testing. And again, it's hard to Well, how do you know it meets as a secondary suite? So they prescriptively tried to make this set up so at least it meets some minimum standards, and it is a little bit lower than what you'd find in other types of uses. When you get into multi-commercial or multi-residential, it goes up. If you have an elevator in the building, that actually has a separate type of sound separation as well. So just finishing up, we're really close to the end here. So thanks for hanging in with me. We have our applications, so be very mindful of your applications going in. Make sure they're very complete. Don't wait too long to bring them in because we're getting into spring. That means everything's getting busier and busier, and you just want to get those in sooner than later so the team can and make sure they're developed. There's really good information on the checklist, the application checklist, what to bring in, and I'm just going to highlight that. So when we're talking about, again, I brought in this one of the first few slides here, the fire protection requirements for detached houses. Could go for townhouses, a garden suite. Just think about, okay, what do I need to put in a site plan to deal with the fire protection matters? Like, make sure you got that in your head. And again, it's outlined. A lot of it's outlined in the guide, and be further, or sorry, the bulletin that's there now, and we'll really beef it up in the guide. Floor plans. Okay, what do I need a floor plan to show substantial compliance with the code and make sure nothing gets messed up on site? You want to, again, put the fire separations, pull that codes, cut and paste that table, that component, that W1C or whatever you want to use, put it on there and try. Hopefully, the builder will build to that and work with the building official. Elevations, obviously, spatial calculations. You may have some exterior protection issues if you're doing multi-unit. And part 9, and these sections and details again. Do you have any issues with limiting distance? So you have to make it very clear on floor plans and the sections that this wall is going to be built a little bit differently. You actually have load-bearing elements holding a fire separation between floors. So you're not using normal drywall. You have to use rated drywall. Even though it's not a fire separation, you still need to, and there's table diagrams in the code for part 9 on walls and floors and exterior walls, and I think some attic spaces as well. At framing inspection, again, they're going to check any previous issues. They're going to review the substantial changes that may have occurred. So hopefully you haven't changed windows sizes, particularly on side property lines, that now could just mess up your spatial calculations. Please always, if you're making a change, just let the building officials know before it's too late. So we got verification of spatial calculation, back framing, fire blocking, backing for fire stopping. So you can have large donuts, and those donuts have little prongs on them that have to be screwed into the wall. So I've seen 1 screw put into the studs and 3 screws on drywall linkers, and that's not right. So make sure your backing is in for those large penetrations with the more robust fire separations. Soffit protection, again, making sure it goes through the attic spaces into the overhangs. That's your fire blocking. You can do that at frame or insulation. And sound barrier, again, making sure all those details. And if you're having questions of how this works, especially if you're new to fire separations and fire stopping, start it, do a mock-up, talk it out with the building officials and your site team. And once you figure it out, go with it and try not to make a change and try not to poke holes in it after. Because when we get to occupancy, that's all going to be reviewed again. And I just listed a few things here. Make sure your smoke alarm covers are off. And they test. Again, soffit protection, both and spatially, that where you need it. If the overhang got too close, and there's a code limit on those, right? Of if you have a really short setback and then you have overhangs, there's some specifications on that soffit material, or if it's over an opening in a multi-unit building. Don't change the script. Stay with the drawings, review if there is a change. Make sure you're ready for inspections as a project manager or general contractor. Make sure you're ready and make sure, again, some of these items were done. And your fire stopping is, your fire blocking is correct. Your fire stopping is not fire blocking, spray foam. Completion of the firewalls, make sure there's no damage to these kind of separations. And then, your kitchen clearances here. When in doubt, reach out. Again, go online. There's some growing materials online. There's some really great people. Unfortunately, we've lost Mike Gauss, so I'm going to update this. It's really unfortunate. It was passing, but there's a really great team, and they pulled together, and they're moving ahead, continuing to make changes. Reach out. If changes are being made from their permanent issue drawings, let your teammates know, both on site and at the building department, and work some things out. Next one is March 26th after March break, building envelope and mechanical systems. Feel free to provide any commentary or suggestions on that or anything that comes up here. And I'd be happy to take questions, but we're out of time. So I'm going to stop. This will be posted probably in the next couple days. We have a video recording of it too. So again, thank you for joining in. Tell others that this is now out there. Again, work with your building department, especially if you're new to multi-unit. If you've gone from houses with secondary suites, that's a learning process in itself. But when you have your builders and your designers and your trades all trying to move up the ladder, in the real estate market to build multi-unit or commercial tenant alterations, make sure your drawings are really thoroughly done, a lot of good information. Make sure the building department is engaged with you, and especially if you have any changes. So that's it for me. I got to jump to my other job and really appreciate your time. And Nicholas, you going to close up?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. We really appreciate your time. And yeah, we'll catch you well, I'll see you Friday and we'll catch you in a couple of
Yeah,
weeks online. Yeah.
great. Take care, everybody.
Yeah. Only comment I have on Ken's presentation is that's that third to last slide there. Thanks for the shout out about Mike. We really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Just I should have introduced myself right off the bat. Nick Marnick. I am the manager of Land and Building Services until the end of April. We've had some unfortunate news about Peter as well, so I'll be
Oh,
sitting in there. Feel free to reach out to me until then, and
yeah.
I'm more than happy to
Yeah.
help the industry and help Ken support educating the industry.
Yeah. And again, this is life and unfortunate things happen. So it's really, again, important for the industry to stay tight and support each other through these times. And yeah, really feel for everybody there. So good luck with everything. And I'll see you again on the 26th.
Yeah, well, I'll add to the recording. Thanks, everyone.